I guess this is where I say, please be seated, but I suspect you're probably already seated at home. So, I am a big fan of Ronald Rolheiser. I've been reading his books and studying them since I was a seminary student. And today he tells us something about a woman who I suspect most of us are familiar with, Dorothy Day, a person I admire greatly. In her autobiography called The Long Loneliness, Dorothy shares how she once prayed at a very low time in her life. So you may know that she was not raised in the faith, but came to it on her own after a little bit of a romance with atheism. An intellectual, moving in Marxist and anti-church circles, she entered her 20s convinced that if anyone had the courage to look life square in the eye, she or he would not believe in God. She had support in that. In fact, the love of her life at that time shared her views. She moved in with him and bore his child outside of marriage. Messy. Life is messy. The birth of this child, a daughter, who I actually met when I was in studies in Chicago, changed her in ways she had never foreseen. Holding her sweet infant daughter, she was so overcome with awe and gratitude that she prayed spontaneously. For so much joy, she said, I need to thank someone. Her faith was born from that. It was born from the purest spring of all, gratitude, living a life of gratitude. So she took instructions, she got baptized and became a Christian. The father of her child, naturally, was probably upset by all of this and warned her that if the child were baptized, he would leave her. She had the child baptized, and he did leave her. Many of her friends reacted similarly. Life is messy. So even as she was buoyed up by her newfound faith, she found herself very much alone. She floundered like this for a while, feeling even more lonely and unsure of herself. One day she just couldn't take it anymore. She put her young daughter in the care of friends and took a train to Washington, D.C., where she prayed for a day at the shrine of the Immaculate Conception. Her prayer that day was one of utter helplessness. In essence, she said to God, I've given up, a lot for you, and you haven't done anything for me. I'm lost, I'm alone, I'm unsure of what to do. Running out of energy and patience. I need help. I need it now, not in some distant future. Help me. Help me now. I can't go on like this. Does that sound familiar? Well, she got back to New York and walked up to her apartment. There was a man sitting on the steps, waiting for her. He had told her that he'd heard about her and had an idea, and that he needed her help. Then he explained to her the concept of the Catholic worker. Now, I could talk about the Catholic worker for another hour, but I think you all may have heard of what Catholic worker is. But that man's name was Peter Maurin, and the rest is history. From that moment on, she had a vision for her life. But this Sunday, most of us will probably notice mostly walking on water together, and Peter sinking into it. And that's another interesting spiritual dimension that someone that we also might know, John Foley, would like to suggest. What about Jesus in his difficult times? What do you think he might have felt? We know that Jesus had emotions. We've seen it before. When Lazarus died, when his dear cousin John the Baptist died, he had taken a boat in order to grieve quietly by himself. We read about that last week. They followed him. The people sought him out. He didn't tell them to go away, but rather he prayed with them. He was moved by their needs and attended to them. He must have been completely worn out physically and emotionally. Life is messy. We don't always get what we want or do what we want to do. And then came the story for this Sunday. Jesus sends the crowd away at last. And there's something strange you might want to notice that's usually ignored. He made the disciples get out of the boat and precede him to the mountain on the other side. Why send them ahead? Why stay there alone? The answer is pretty easy. He still needed to process his friend John's death. and he hadn't gotten to do that yet. He needed to do that work. Any good therapist will tell you that's a good idea. He climbed up the mountainside, and the wind came up that we read about. He could not have been comfortable. I sure would love to have known what his prayer was like. He had studied the scriptures since he was a child. So maybe the story in our first reading came to mind. The prophet Elijah, too, was up on the mountainside, and there, too, a heavy wind came up. The Lord was not in the wind, we are told, not in the earthquake, not in the fire. Where was he? In the tiny whispering sound that followed. Jesus on the mountainside heard this voice, too. But what did he feel? What could it possibly have felt like for him? Let's take a shot at it. He opened his bruised trust to the Father and lay this trust alongside his very personal loss. Perhaps God reassured him that even against the evidence, all human beings have to rely on God, especially when it seems the tragedy has the upper hand. All human beings need to rely on God, especially when it seems the tragedy has the upper hand. I'm sure we all know how that feels. Jesus was divine, but divine consciousness and knowledge rested only in the deepest realm of his soul and needed this time to emerge in the messiness of his own life. Then at last, Jesus does walk on water. How must it feel to leave the solid ground and walk on slushy liquid? I bet you've thought about that. What would that be like? Perhaps this walking was symbolic of the trust he had come to in his night of prayer. Trust. I think we would be well to remember two things today. Being lost is a place, too. We've probably all been there. And maybe trust feels like walking on water. Maybe trust feels like walking on water. So let us approach his altar with faith and trust and confidence in him who can calm all storms.